Don't worry, your eyes are not deceiving you. Here is an idea for helping you paint in a more impressionistic and loose way. I was browsing through an old album, old photos recently, and came across this photo of a little trail through some woods. Not exactly sure where the woods are. I was about to hit the delete button because it's so out of focus, as you can see. Very difficult to, if you're not familiar with where I was, very difficult to see what's going on there. But then I squinted my eyes a bit and pondered for a while. And I thought this might make an interesting exercise to try and paint this scene in watercolor and try and exploit all of the different watercolor techniques that you've got there. So my aim was to create a painting where the journey was more important than the destination, not really a painting that I might be proud of or hang on a wall, but instead have a little bit of fun and really try and push watercolor to do what it does, especially with those techniques. If you're a watercolor painter already, you'll be familiar with techniques like wet in wet, wet in dry, dry in wet. So this is a recording of my process, and I'll try and give as much commentary along the way of what I'm doing and the paints, the colors I'm using, the techniques I'm doing. And at the end, I'll give a little bit of a critique on myself as well, try and be hard on myself. Let me try and decipher this and unpick it. I'm not sure if you can see, but we have some trees on the left, trees on the right. There's a trail going up the middle here, which sort of almost snakes around. There's a light patch there. Well, that's the other thing. When I'm looking at a photograph like this, trying to decipher, trying to find the shapes, where are the lights, where are the darks. So there's some obvious lighter areas here, and some dark areas over the left-hand side, the right-hand side, and light hitting the trunk of that tree there, and lots of little twigs around it as well. Quite obviously, you can see there's loads of soft edges, but maybe we'll have just a few hard edges in there as well as a bit of contrast. And the light direction, that's the other thing. Where's the light coming from? Well, I think it's sort of top right, I believe. That's where the light's coming from. And well, let's see how we get on. Let's get right into the painting and see how loose we can go. I'll just go through the materials I'm using first of all. As per usual, paper is Saunders Waterford, 300 grams or 140 pounds. It's 15 inches across by 11 down. And I am using a 2B pencil just to get in the outlying shapes. Where are those lights? Where are those darks? Where there's some vertical edges. I'll go through my palette, the colors I'm using as I start the painting proper, but this is always my first stage here. And with this sort of scene, I don't really need to spend an awful lot of time doing that outline drawing. As I say, just getting in the main shapes, where those vertical trunks going to be, the little patches of light and dark and so on. Once I'm happy with that, I will now just make the whole paper as damp as I can, because I want to try and utilize the wet in wet technique as much as possible. Sorry about the strobing effect on the video. I think it's the lighting I was using at the time. I was using some temporary lighting that I'm not used to. So just to recap, trying to make the paper as wet as possible with a soft mop brush. Could have used a sponge to go a little bit quicker, but an even application of that water. There's a little bit of shine on the surface as well. Even application. The paper is going to buckle a little bit, but that doesn't really matter, to be honest with you. It will dry much flatter, but those little bumps and dips in the paper doesn't really matter to me. So I'm just letting the paper now rest a little bit and just thinking about my approach here, which is really just, as I said earlier on, just have a little bit of fun with watercolor and try and recreate this impressionist scene. Starting from the top and working my way down, a little bit of cobalt blue there, mixed in with a little bit of cerulean as well. And then I've got a spring green here. The colours I'm using are handmade watercolour paints from Jackman's Art Materials. The description is in the link and you can get a 10% discount if you use that link. Lovely quality professional grade paints that I use. And some, I mean, the blues are definitely really bright and a very intense colour. Anyway, I'm just applying these very weak, very wet washes of colour into this damp paper. There is a slight slope on my board, maybe about 10% or so. So it is, you can just see it travelling down a tiny bit. So a little bit of green on the right hand side. This is a spring green and a viridian green there. Viridian and that spring green, a little bit of burnt sienna. Well, let me go through the colours that I've got. From the top, neutral tint, then burnt umber, burnt sienna. There's a yellow ochre, then a spring green, then a viridian green, then a cobalt green, cobalt blue in the middle, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson. So that's what I'm alternating between there, alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue. Then below alizarin crimson, I've got a cadmium red, then a light red, then a cadmium orange and a cadmium yellow. So now a lot darker down this bottom left-hand corner. The brush I'm using here is a Raphael Soft Aqua size 4, I think. And it's sort of, well, it's synthetic. And I could have used almost any brush for this stage where I'm getting in some smaller lines there, more narrower lines. But this is quite a nice brush. It's sort of in between a really soft brush and a stiff brush. It's got the kind of it's got the kind of feeling of a mop brush, but it's still got that bit of stiffness about it. I'm adding in these colours here, these darker colours, to mainly that pathway that's going through the middle, these darker colours. There is some grass, a lot of grass on the left and the right. I'll display the source photo as we go through now and again, but adding in that bit of grassy bit in the bottom. Now, alternating to a smaller brush and getting in some of the foliage in the canopy of the trees on the left-hand side. Trees on the left-hand side, these aren't large mature trees. They're sort of little young saplings in this wood. It's not a particularly tidy wood, I would say. It's very much a natural wood and I don't think it's been maintained, but so all these young saplings are growing up all over the place, and it's nature is just taking its course. As I'm coming down, I will need to go a little bit darker to the base of these trees where there's a tiny bit of shade coming, sorry, a bit of shadow at the base of those trees. tiny bit lighter towards the middle where there's this light, almost like a light at the end of the tunnel. A little bit of a light bit right at the end there, which is almost like a focal point. Using a paper towel just to dry out that central area and make sure I get a little bit of a harder edge there. Where I'm painting, it wasn't particularly dry. This is another thing in watercolor, is what's the relative humidity of your room? Just to be, not to turn this into a science lesson, but the more humid it is, then you've got longer to work with watercolor, particularly a cotton-based paper that I believe will stay wetter. It will stay damper longer than a wood-based paper. So a little bit longer to work, and you've got then a lot longer to use this sort of wet in wet techniques, and this is more almost a dry in wet technique here, where there's not a lot of moisture on my brush, and just picking up color out of the palette there, almost with no water on it, but there's sufficient dampness in the paper just to mix with that pigment and still give me fairly soft edges. But as time goes on, the paper is going to dry a little bit. I know you could also use a spray bottle to keep the paper wetter. I know some people that will wet the paper on the back and the front for good measure. For me, those techniques don't work particularly well, particularly the spray bottle. I've never really got on with a spray bottle, so I'm just having to work as fast as I can here and get in these main softer areas, these bigger, bolder, softer areas as quickly as I can. Bit of shadow across the left-hand side, and there's a lighter patch just where I am now. There's the main lighter area at the end of the trail, and then there's a couple coming towards the foreground and a larger one on the right hand side, and then these smaller ones on the left. As I said earlier, I really am enjoying the process of doing this. It's just painting in a really loose way, having a bit of fun with the paint and these brush marks, and just exploring these different techniques and the timing of watercolor as well. This is really quite thick, this paint, thick and dark, this paint now. Also with watercolor, it is going to dry a little bit lighter than when you first apply it. So I'm going to have to overcompensate on some of the intensity of the colors and the values a bit, because it is going to dry a little bit lighter. Subtly, across some of these lighter areas, there are some shadows of branches going across that are just sort of intersecting these lighter areas. So I'll just get in a few of those. It's almost like a sort of abstract painting, but really more, I think more impressionistic, more in the impressionist style, where these brush marks are important. The shapes of the brush marks, these sort of elliptical brush marks, and almost stabbing the paper. And then how many brush strokes you're putting in as well, trying to complete the painting in as fewer brush strokes as possible and giving the impression of that scene, this little trail through the woods. And trying to work in this way with the damp paper, you've got a time limit really before the paper really does go so dry that you are not able to use that dry and wet technique too much. That's that little bit of light hitting that trunk. So a tiny bit of negative painting there to use the darker paint to paint around a shape and create that light in there. Over on the right hand side, I'm picking up a lot of diagonal lines from, I'm not sure whether it's when I took the photo, I was moving and was maybe a little bit too impatient, didn't stand still, but I had this out of focus shot. I'm not sure if it's the rays of the sun coming through the canopy of the trees or the general direction of those branches, but it's quite a nice pattern, those angular lines coming from that right hand side. Yeah, so going back to impressionism and trying to use these bold colors, maybe a little bit brighter than they are in the scene. In the source photo, there's a lot of green, there's a lot of brown, but that's it really. I'm picking up on warms and cools here. Not so many cools right now. I've added a little bit of blue in that distance there, but I'm tempted to add a bit of blue in on the ground where I can just pick up from the photo a little bit of blue. I'm not sure if it was actually blue, whether there were any little wildflowers there on the trail, or it was the actual camera that just displayed that little hint of blue going through the ground. But I'll try and pick up on that towards the end. This is a quinacridone gold down the bottom right corner. And with this, now I've got a round brush here, which is a size 4, I think. And it's ideal for creating these little thinner branches, twigs, tiny marks. This is that real darkness down at the base of some of those trees. Really dark in there. And these darker areas of shadow, I'm looking at the source photo and thinking about shapes of those. I'm constantly looking at the source photo and trying to pick up those shapes. Again, a little bit of negative painting around some of the lighter vertical trunks that are catching the light. And I think already I'm beginning to sense it's gradually coming together with the left-hand side, the right-hand side. Just where I am now, there's a small little group of trees that are creating that shadow coming towards me. Neutral tint up the top there is always a good pigment to have in your palette to get those instant darks where you do want something quite dark or black, but also very good to dilute it a little bit and mix in another color with it. Let's just emphasize, I'm just going to emphasize some of these diagonal marks here. Now, here's some dry brush marks. and the paper is pretty much dry at this stage. There might be a little bit of residual dampness in it, but it is on the whole quite dry. So to still try and get those softer edges, I can use a softer process with these dry brush marks, and they're the side of the brush as well, just to use these different techniques. Just a bit of scraping up with that brush. It would drive you mad if you had to try and decipher that photo and try and pick out all the different types of vegetation and foliage there and try and paint every single leaf. We're just creating an impression and utilizing all these different watercolor techniques. So what have we done so far? We've done wet. What techniques have we used so far? Wet in wet, dry in wet, as the paper was drying. Body paint here with my brush. We've used quite a lot of dry brush marks, and they are helped. Dry brush marks are helped with the texture of the paper. So if you've got a slightly rough textured surface, I'm using this cold press here, but if you've got rough paper, I know a lot of artists prefer to use rough exclusively. I tend to, for me, rough is too rough, and I prefer, oh, there's a bit of warmth going in now, a bit of that red. I prefer in the middle. It just keeps my options open a little bit more, but there's still a bit of texture on the surface, enough so that when you use that dry brush mark, it does give a nice sort of deckled effect to your mark. Coming from those two trees on the right, there's a little bit of a shadow coming from those that are just starting to create there. Look at these shadows coming out from those trees. Again, dry brush mark, trying to create those. Perhaps the sun, perhaps I felt the sun was in that, almost ahead of us, almost doing contre-jour or top right, I reckon, that where the light's coming from. Dry brush mark, really dry now. There's no water on that brush at all. It's just pure paint. And I know most of the people watching this will probably be using tube paint. I think if I used the hard pans, I'd have a difficult job trying to utilize this style. I'd have to pretty much dampen the paint quite a lot before I could do this. But the tube paints, they do stay moist for quite some time. And if they do go a little bit hard, I'll just use my spray bottle. That's one use I do have of a spray bottle to freshen up my paint in the palette just before painting, just to soften things up a little bit, and they come back to life if they're starting to. If I haven't painted for a day or so, or a couple of days, they might start to cake up a little bit. Now, if those lines are too hard, I'll use my finger just to smudge it a little bit. Being careful not to really make it appear as if it was an accident or it's overworked, but just to use the fingertips. And at the end of the painting, I ended up with quite dirty fingers. Just to use my fingers to quickly lift off a little bit of paint, or to gently just merge it as I'm doing here. The actual area where I was just smudging using my fingers there, that actually, I can remember, was actually still quite damp over there for some reason. Maybe the water had settled there, gone through the paper, settled below. I'm painting on, below the paper is a shiny plastic surface, which is, rather than painting on a piece of board or wood, it might just make the paper, let the paper stay damper longer. You see what I mean? If it was more of an absorbent surface, like say wood, or if it was an untreated wood surface, then that might just suck in that moisture just a little bit more and leave me less time. So that having that sort of plasticky, shiny, even if it did on metal, that would be better. So here I'm using a bit of lavender and cerulean blue to add in that little bit of coolness along the trail. I'll apply it in some other areas in a minute. That's ultramarine blue, neutral tint, going a lot darker in that bottom left-hand corner, going over the tape, which will, when I remove the tape, that gives a nice crisp white edge to the painting. I'm sort of almost in the detail stage of the painting now, where I'm just pulling things together and applying little tinier blobs of paint just to try and emphasize the darks a little bit more. That's quite important there, just crossing that, connecting, going over that lighter space and connecting the middle ground to the background across that lighter space, going over to the lighter area. There's another little patch of darkness there which I've put in. If the edges are too hard, just use my fingers again to soften things up before the paint's dried. I could have used a rigger brush for some of these finer lines going on that right hand side, but that might just give me too hard an edge, and there might be just a little bit too thin as well. I think with this brush, with these dry brush marks, it's just given me the right kind of marks and thickness for some of those smaller branches. Up in that top left corner, I need to just fill in that area up there and go a little bit darker up there. And those lines that I'm doing now, they're sort of like a mirror image of the lines on the left, perhaps in a subtle way just leading our eyes a little bit more into that lightness at the end of the trail. Lavender, more lavender, cerulean blue, bit of cobalt blue, cerulean blue, lavender. Lavender's quite a nice colour. It's quite opaque. I call it a bit chalky. So when you mix it with a little bit of water, you get that sort of, well, it's opaque, but it gives you that sort of chalky appearance, and it's great, neat here. Lavender with the ultramarine blue. I should imagine this is as close to combining oil painting with watercolor painting as you can get. If I was painting with oils now, I assume this would be pretty much the same process, the same techniques. You've got the lights down there already, and it might be fairly dry, but you're just going over that surface with these darks. I have to be careful to know when to stop, as in those lighter areas there. The danger is that I can start, as the more I look at the photo, I pick up on extra twigs and horizontal lines and vertical lines and lines at an angle, and I might just ruin the freshness of it. I just want to try and get the impression of that light coming in from the end, the light coming in from the top right corner, and just be painting in this impressionistic way, trying to be as brief as I can in the way I'm describing the scene. I've now picked up a little bit of white paint, fresh, pure white paint out of the tube. This is white gouache, by the way, not sort of strictly speaking watercolor paint, but a gouache paint, so very opaque, thicker paint. Almost, well, it's straight out the tube, a little bit of a damp brush and smaller brush just to pick up on a few of the lights hitting the right-hand side of the tree trunks. Just a little bit of light there where it's catching different objects and shining through. I don't want to overdo this too much. I want to try and, with watercolor, you want to try and use the lights of the paper to give you those really bright lights. You can never, very rarely can you replicate with white paint the same effect as leaving the paper unpainted. And the danger is if you overdo it with white paint, it just looks a little bit false. You lose that freshness. It looks overworked. And also, if you dilute it too much with water, it gets, well, going back to chalky, the chalky appearance. You get it just looks a little bit too chalky and messy, and a white line dries, and you get that sort of greyish colour in the middle, and then a sort of white outer edge to that brush mark. So when I use this white gouache, it's with a minimal amount of water, just a tiny bit of water to moisten the brush before I dip it in the tube. I do have a little blob of white gouache on my palette. You won't see it, but it's in the very bottom right-hand corner. And I will sometimes mix that with some other colours to give me those lights. That's just a few little extra white patches coming down, or lighter patches coming down the trail. And then coming from the tree that was leaning over, and I did a bit of negative painting around, there's a few upright shoots coming out of that tree. I guess where the tree was leaning, and then these shoots come out of that tree, they're trying to reach for the light. So they're going up vertically from that leaning trunk, or at an angle, just searching for the light. And with the amount of layers I put on this, the paper might be still just a little bit damp. And yes, I can use my finger still to tone down that white. If I think it's just a little bit too strong, then just smudge it a little bit with the finger before it's had time to dry. Time for some more darks. And the brush I'm using now is quite an old brush. It's lost its point, and almost like a very small flat brush. But it does give some of these older brushes that have lost their points, they do have, as long as you know how they react when you put them on the paper, they can give you some interesting brush marks. So I'm quite reluctant in throwing out old brushes, and may go back to them. You can see how flat, I don't know whether you just saw there, but when I tilted the brush, you can see how flat that edge is. And it's lost a few hairs. The point has long since gone, and using it almost like a little flat brush. A few more dry brush marks. Coming up, a tiny bit of foliage coming away from the underneath of that leaning tree. Cobalt blue, lavender. Put on a little bit of body paint here on that left-hand side. I'm nearing probably the end of this painting. I'm just really still pulling it together, and the most difficult thing, of course, is knowing when to stop. Might be just a few more little twigs in this lighter area. And the brush is so dry now when I'm touching the paper. Well, it's hardly making any impression at all, which is probably just what I need. I don't want to, at this stage, add in anything significant. It's just little final touches to it. And I think I'm done. So I'll go on to the critique now. Just a quick recap of my source photo: a little trail through the woods, taking an out of focus photograph and trying to paint in an impressionistic, looser way with watercolor, that snaky little trail through the woods. Let me go to my end painting and try and give myself a little bit of a critique. So I think I've got the main feeling of the light, these patches of light, and the branches, the tree trunks, and these patches, these shapes of lights and darks across the ground. I could have gone, to be critical of myself, I could have gone, let me go back, could have gone a little bit lighter there. Now I did try, as the paper was quite damp, I did use that paper tissue to make this area quite dry so that any painting around that would give me a little bit of a harder edge and the paint wouldn't merge into that lighter area. So I could have gone a bit lighter there, and also trying to think of the shape of that area as well. So it sort of goes up and then that almost like an arrow. It's like an arrowhead or something like that as a shape. So could have gone a bit lighter there. I might have overdone it with the white paint. I always, when I'm giving advice to other people, I always pick up on that too much white paint, and I'm guilty of it, like most of us. Maybe just a little bit too much of the white paint. And by the same token, the blue as well. I think the blue kind of worked over here, but the actual marks of the blue here, they've sort of obliterated the freshness I had before. I don't think it needed that blue there. Maybe I might have got away with it down in the bottom left-hand corner. But on the whole, I'm quite happy with it. As I say, it's not meant to be a painting I'm particularly proud of or would promote or sell or exhibit. It was just a bit of fun, taking a photograph, an interesting exercise, and really trying to exploit all those different watercolor techniques, the wet in wet, wet in dry, dry in wet, dry brush marks using body paint, and a little bit of white paint as well. Just to explain the humidity of where I was working on this painting. Don't worry, I was not painting at 12 minutes past 4 in the morning. That's wrong. But 69%. So quite humid. And that meant that I had longer to work on the painting. And it wasn't too warm either. Well, warmish. Let's say room temperature with the temperature, but quite humid as well. And it's quite interesting sometimes when I have this near to where I paint. It's quite interesting just to see how humid it is. When I'm painting outdoors in the summer, the humidity might be 20 or 30%. So things are going to dry quite rapidly, and you're going to have to work even quicker, or just change your techniques. Maybe use more dry brush marks rather than wet in wet. Anyway, hope you liked it. Catch up with you on the next video.